Howdy, friends. This is Matt Sewell, and you're listening to episode 99 of the Popecast, a history of the papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non-boring stories on the successors of St. Peter and a reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before. Well, a couple things here. So we're back from a very long hiatus, unplanned hiatus, so we apologize for that. But for all the new listeners who have found the Popecast in the past year and change, we're really grateful that you're here. For all of our longtime listeners, so grateful to you for sticking with us. We're very glad to be back. So a little bit of a backstory, I suppose. So I had a rather massive career shift from a job in software that I'd had for 8-9 years. Last July, decided to quit that job and go full-time as a handyman, remodeler, contractor, running my own business. As the old adage goes, which has turned out to be very true, that you have a 9 to 5 working for someone else. You go to working 24/7 when you go working for yourself. So that ended up being more true than I had maybe anticipated, but it's been a huge blessing, huge gift. I have definitely wanted to get back to the Popecast, have not wanted to let it die. And so very happily, we're back for episode 99 and hopefully many more into the future. So this episode is an interview episode, obviously, so it's going to be a little bit more long form, but we will definitely be getting back to our regular shorter form papal bios. But this week we have Wayne Kalayjian, who's a first-time author. His book is called Saving Michelangelo's Dome. It's about the dome of St. Peter's Basilica and a really, really fascinating story from about 300 years ago, the 1740s, when it quite literally was on the verge of collapsing. So Wayne is a civil and structural engineer who has designed bridges, buildings, tunnels, airports, pipelines, railroads, data centers, and power stations all around the world. Super fascinating life story. Again, first-time author. He's a lecturer at the University of Southern California, USC, and is an engineering expert for the California Department of Consumer Affairs. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and art history from Tufts University. We'll talk about that unique combination. He has a master's degree in structural engineering from Stanford, a master's degree in management from MIT, and as mentioned, this is his first book. It's a fascinating conversation. If any of you are remotely close to being like me, if you're listening to the show, you probably are, being a papal history nerd, have any interest in construction, any fascination with how the materials that humanity has used to build buildings, or just any sort of fascination with church architecture and the sort of challenges that go into it, you'll, I think, really find this episode very intriguing. Without further ado, enjoy this episode on the book Saving Michelangelo's Dome. Well, Wayne Kalayjian, thank you for joining the Popecast. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, well, I know we've been chatting a little bit before we started recording, but your book is Saving Michelangelo's Dome. It just came out. We're recording this on April Fool's Day, I guess, but it just came out a few weeks ago, officially, yes. Right?
Correct. Yeah.
So obviously, I think most of the show we'll spend chatting about the book, but I'd love to start with just a little bit of your background. You're a first-time author, from my understanding, but you're not. But you've obviously had an illustrious background before that. So personal, professional background, however much you'd like to share. Who are you, and how did you get to this point? What's a little bit of your story?
Thank you. Well, I'm a civil and structural engineer by profession. I was raised in the Methodist Church, so a Protestant through and through, and I really did not have a solid grounding in Roman Catholic traditions at all before I started writing the book. I've been in and around construction and designing buildings all over the world, including once in a while a dome. And they're very complicated to design and to build. So I can vouch that everything in the book about how difficult the dome was, it's true. And even in today's more sophisticated world of construction and our advanced designs, advanced structural engineering designs. I live in California. I was raised in Boston, where there's a very strong tradition, Roman Catholic tradition, especially Irish. So I've always been in and around Roman Catholics to an extent, and I have a love of art history as well. And you cannot study art history and not have an appreciation for the church and the church's role in fostering the great artworks that we, have in Western civilization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So obviously, I thought that was interesting too. The engineering background paired with a degree in art history. So where did maybe the initial spark to, the merging of those two, and then where the book came out of, or where the initial kind of fascination came out of, was that from growing up in Boston, where as far as America is concerned, that's one of the most historically rich places, especially architecturally too. But where did that kind of initial fascination come from and inspiration for the book?
Well, I first learned about this story when I was an undergrad, and I was early being introduced to structural engineering. At the same time, I was taking some of my early survey courses in art history. And it just happened to coincide that I was reading a history of civil engineering. And in the very middle of the book, there were 4 pages dedicated to these cracks in the dome of St. Peter's that was designed by Michelangelo, and how something very important happened there. And it just happened to be a happy coalescence of engineering. I'm studying engineering. I'm studying art history. And here's a reference to Michelangelo, cracks in the dome, something very important happening. And it always stuck with me. And you would think, of course, it's the most famous church in the world, designed by the most famous artist ever in one of the most amazing cities in the world. There had to have been books written about this. There had to have been, right? That's my assumption. But there wasn't. Mm-hmm. And I learned why as I was doing my research. And we can talk about that. But I learned about this story 40 years ago, and it just stuck with me. Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah, 40 years in the making. That's very interesting. I'm intrigued to hear. Well, we were probably I think that's a great maybe segue into why there weren't any books about it. But I would just say it's very similar to the existence of this podcast in general. I know we talked a little bit about it before we started recording, but I thought for sure there had to be a Papal History podcast, short form. It's a dry topic generally, where I think some of the earlier episodes, dry, dusty history books is the phrase I always used, that you can listen to this and hear Papal history without having to dive into a dry, dusty history book or something like that. But there really wasn't like that, which is just remarkable because there's such a rich topic. And this story is that kind of in miniature. And then for it to marinate for 40 years. So yeah, what was some of the reasons why there wasn't a book about it, as far as you had discovered?
So when I first introduced the idea to my agent, I was fortunate enough to have a literary agent from a failed book from 10 years ago. There's a lot of failure here when you're a writer. She was intrigued, but she expressed the same hesitation, which is, Wayne, you're talking about the most famous church by the most famous artist in the most famous city, and you're telling me you've come up with something new? That doesn't ring true. And I said, Laurie Abkemeyer, who's my agent, I said, Laurie, I haven't found it. And so she did some research on her own. She kind of agreed it hadn't happened. And then once she defined the requirements that I would need to go through to draft my proposal, I quickly found out why it hadn't been sort of researched, because it's really hard. It was a story that had never been assembled from start to finish. It was a known story, but it was a little known story. And it was only told in fragments, little bits and pieces here and there. And these fragments came from all kinds of sources, papal biographies, history of construction, various scholarly papers about engineering written for other engineers. So they were kind of hard to digest. And then you had the original source texts, which I didn't even know existed until I started doing the research. And, I thought that my bibliography was going to be about 70 citations. I ended up having 170, and I probably had double that in terms of the amount of additional stuff that I did go through. And not only was there a lot of information, but it was layered. So you had to tell the story at different stages of time. The Vatican Hill era, the early New St. Peter's era, Michelangelo's era, the dome being constructed era, the 150 years after that while the cracks were developing era. And then the period of my book, which is only 6 years. It takes 1,500 years to create the problem or to create the context, and 6 years to solve it. But you need to know that 1,500 years to be able to appreciate the 6 years in the book. So to have to tell that story was really hard. And took a lot of research, but I loved it. Don't get me wrong. It was very worthwhile, but I could understand very early into my research why this book had never been written before.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think that's a good segue into kind of the overview of the book, and it's really very remarkable. Not only just the depth of research clearly that you did just by reading it, but then all of the pieces that are required to kind of fully appreciate, not even understand. Because you say, okay, well, St. Peter's Basilica, sure, I've seen that before. Oh, wow, interesting. There was cracks in it 300 years ago. And oh, interesting, the Pope and Three Mathematicians figured out how to make sure it didn't collapse so that we in 2024 can appreciate it. But there's it just doesn't even do justice to the whole story once you know it. So you cover, Constantine establishing the Vatican Hill, which you said was just kind of a marshy wasteland during the Roman Empire, but then also the development of science, the development of Roman Catholicism to get to the point to build this titan of architecture. So maybe just run through real quick kind of an overview of the book, because we've talked about the problem that is the reason for reading the book or writing the book, but what is kind of does the book go through to get to that point, and then kind of the ramifications afterwards, without obviously giving away the ultimate ending?
Sure. So you need to know a little bit about history. You need to know a little bit about engineering. You need to know a little bit about construction, church history. You need to know a little bit about a lot of things to sort of appreciate the main point of the story, which doesn't really start until chapter 6. So really, there's 5 chapters that the reader, I think, will appreciate once they get through those first 5 chapters, because then I'm able to put them in the shoes of the people in 1740 who were confronted by the problem. But to get to those shoes, you have to first talk about Imperial Rome. What was Vatican Hill like? It was called Vaticanus Mons. Vatican Hill, and it was a desolate area, and it took several hundred years. It was to develop into the sacred site that it is today. It was a cemetery for the early churches. It was a burial ground for many of the early popes, and it was a burial ground not for the well-to-do. It was for the modest people of modest means, right? This was not a place where Romans gravitated toward. It was the outback. And so understanding that, and then Constantine coming along and saying, we're going to build this sacred shrine to St. Peter here. And he didn't do it in the most obvious, easy place. He built it in probably the hardest spot of Vatican. Right. And for good reason, because that's where St. Peter was buried. Mm-hmm. He was not buried in an easy spot. He was buried in an obscure part of the hill, because the Romans, he was not a person who the Romans wanted to amplify, right?
Sure. Exactly the opposite, right?
Right. And so for that reason, Constantine had to do a lot of grooming to the site to make it constructible, one of which was it's a marsh, so the soil is kind of springy. And so he had to bring a lot of soil, new soil, onto the site because it was sloped and it was springy. So right away, you have a problem, because marshy soil, heavy buildings, what's going to happen to the building? It's going to sink, right? You don't need any help from anything else. That alone is an issue. But now you're bringing in different kind of soil, and the soil types are kind of be mingling, and you don't know how the soil is going to react. So, and that's part of what we call geotechnical engineering. Mm-hmm. So right away, because I have an engineering background, I'm saying, okay, we're going to have a problem, right?
Yeah.
Right. There will be a problem. Right? It's not a good combination. And then then you get to the point where Constantine builds Old St. Peter's. And guess what? It's like any other building. It crumbles and starts falling apart because it's man-made structure.
Yep.
And then it's not always tended to because of papal schisms and earthquakes, and there are multiple sacks of the city by Vandals and other tribes and forces. So the city, this church is sitting there unprotected in its old state, and it's literally falling apart by the 1400s. And then the idea comes, okay, we have a couple options, right? We can either repair it, and that's going to be a pretty big undertaking. We can enlarge it, right? Or we can replace it. Mm-hmm. And then the next chapter of the book talks about, well, the decision is by Julius II, we're going to replace it. There are many episodes, humorous and otherwise, about how that decision was undertaken by Julius II. So then you have to build a basilica, and the basilica now takes 120 years to build, including Michelangelo's. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't even include Bernini's contribution, which everyone sort of, when you walk into St. Peter's Square, it's that wonderful colonnade.
Yep.
That colonnade isn't built for another 50 years beyond that. So you're talking about an enterprise that really takes close to 200 years to build. And there are dozens of architects, builders, popes, and they each have their own ideas on how to do it. So getting through that story, and then, oh, by the way, there's this guy named Michelangelo who comes along, and he scraps everything that came before and starts anew. And he designs a dome. He dies before the dome is able to be constructed. By the way, he lived till he was 90.
I didn't know that actually until this. I maybe saw it at some point. But yeah, he was 2 weeks shy of his 90th birthday.
Yeah, I mean, it was he lived a wonderful, long life. We're blessed to have had him for 90 years.
And was working on this project for the last 18 of them, or 19 or 17 of them, or something like that.
And it was 18 contentious years.
Yeah,
there were people who hated him on the job and wanted him thrown off the job. That was remarkable to learn about the antagonism that existed between himself and the building committee. And the book goes into that. It's an amazing story. I just didn't know it. Mm-hmm. And also the way that he didn't want the job in the first place. He was at 71, he wanted to retire.
Of course, I'm
But
sure.
Paul
Yeah.
the Third, he's a hero in the book. Paul the
Yep.
Third, who was a charming guy. I mean, Paul the Third is this really odd paradox. Um, he's a guy who's used to luxurious living
Yep. Mm-hmm.
and sort of living, you might say, kind of questionable, having questionable morals for a cardinal or a pope.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, he was a firm believer in the church needing to reform.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had this odd dichotomy between his personal life and his view of the church in general. But he was a charming guy. I mean, everything you read, he could ooze charm out of a rock. And
Yeah.
and he had this touch with people, this common touch with people. And he was able to coax Michelangelo out of retirement. And Michelangelo, for 18 years, was with the Capo Maestro, the chief architect of the Vatican. He designed the dome. But then the dome changes in its size, and that's a whole other story. And it's not until Sixtus V in the 1580s when Sixtus comes along and says, we're going to build this dome, because after Michelangelo dies in 1564, the dome is open to the earth. It's just a circular opening, and it's
Mm-hmm.
open to the sky. And no one really knows how to build it. It's expensive and it's complicated. And it's Sixtus V, and he's another hero in this story. He's the Pope in the 1580s who is not just the one who builds the dome, but he changes the landscape of Rome. He recognizes the problem with crime, with bad water, with unemployment, and he sets out to solve those problems, and he does. So the dome on St. Peter's Basilica is just one more thing that he did, right? It's not that it was the only thing he did. He did so much more, which it actually demonstrated just how much good these popes could do, right? They really had a mandate to improve the common good, and especially once you get to the 1450s and onward, they really drive and propel Roman society forward. And they are the driving engines of these improvements, right? And so in any case, the dome is built, and then it takes about 150 years later for the cracks to start to manifest themselves. And in my view, these cracks were probably visible, but when you read the texts, they're not. For whatever reason, people aren't being allowed. My personal view is, you do have earthquakes in central Italy, and that can be the source of many of these cracks. However, for them suddenly in 1740 to wake up suddenly and see that there's all these cracks, it's hard for me to believe. I personally think, knowing how difficult some of these issues are, structural issues are, that these cracks were visible, but no one knew how to deal with them. So they ignored them until they got to the size that they could no longer be ignored. And when I say cracks you couldn't ignore, I'm talking about cracks that were 75 feet long, that were 2 feet wide, that you could walk through.
That, I will say, that part of the book, I was literally just reading the section to my wife this morning. I was cringing reading it, like just thinking, because again, I mentioned before we started recording, like I'm a contractor now. Like I don't work I'm not a mason. I don't work on cathedrals, but like even just in miniature, when you just see, tension and building materials, and like you can tell when something's about to fall over, and like just knowing all of those things in the very, very, very small scale that I work on them, and I've seen people work on them and have talked about them, like thinking of it with a 66 million pound dome that St. Peter's Basilica is.
Right.
Just thinking of that, like a crack so big you can walk through it and it's not falling over. Like, how is that possible? How is it? It's probably going to collapse tomorrow. kind of thing. But yeah, just
Yeah.
like enough to make you shudder. Now, 300 years later, so how did they miss that? Or
Yeah.
how did they just?
Well, I don't think
Yeah.
they missed it. I think it got to the point where they couldn't avoid it anymore. Right. And Von Vitelli, Luigi Von Vitelli, who's the chief architect by that point, is the one who is, I don't want to say stuck with it, but he recognizes something has to be done at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And he's relatively new to being the on-site Vatican. He had been a papal architect for something like 14 years, working
Mm-hmm.
on projects elsewhere on the peninsula, but or within the papal states. But this was really his first sort of go round where he's the architect for the
Mm-hmm.
Basilica, and he can't ignore the problem anymore. And he raises the issue to Pope Benedict XIV. And the story of how he became the Pope is legendary, and he was quite a guy. And so
Mm-hmm.
the story just takes off from there.
Right. Well, so let's go right into Benedict XIV. So I mentioned again before we started. Yeah, Benedict XIV is a guy who's very lesser known in terms of like the common parlance of people who, like, even I think among a lot of Catholics, as in my experience, don't really know who somebody like Benedict XIV is. Maybe like a Pius V because it came around the Reformation, but like Benedict XIV is. I know Benedict XVI, and maybe you've heard of Benedict XV because he was the early 1900s. But he's a really monumental figure in other ways I knew before this book, because he's the one, for example, who, the popular Second Vatican Council, pretty much everybody's heard of the Second Vatican Council, whether you're Catholic or not, like in the 1960s. The process that led to that and culminated in it, Benedict XIV started. Yes. During his papacy as one of the other things, but this as well. And he's just a remarkable figure in general. So yeah, maybe just kind of go over who he was, both before and during when he was Pope. And then, the circumstances obviously go right along with it of how he got to the chair of Peter.
Sure. So Prospero Lorenzo Lambertini was born in Bologna. And he was raised by two relatively upper middle class members of the Bolognese society. They had always been the family, the Lambertinis, and his mother, his maternal, and his mother too. The father, his mother, were always very civic minded, and he was always a very intelligent young man. And he went to Rome to study, to be a priest. At the name escapes me, but he very quickly excels, as you probably expect, because he just becomes, within a few years of his graduation, he's now at the Rota. He becomes a lawyer with the Rota, helping to interpret many of the most difficult legal questions that the popes are confronted with every year. And within a very short period of time, he comes under the recognition of what would become Pope Benedict XIII.
Mm-hmm.
And he becomes invaluable. He becomes a deputy to this pope. And Benedict Lambertini has a reputation for being broad-minded, amiable, and really interested in science. And it coincides with what's going on at the time called the Scientific Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of the very few people in the church, I think, who has a command of the latest scientific principles and an interest and a curiosity in it, especially when it came to Isaac Newton's new theories in a book called The Principia. And this was very unusual for anyone, within the papal circles or the Vatican circles to have this kind of level of deep curiosity. And then he's elevated to cardinal by Benedict XIII. And he's part of two conclaves, two of the most famous conclaves ever. They were back to back, 1730 and then 1740. And in the 1730 conclave, of course, surrounds this massive fraud that was part of that Benedict the 13th was kind of unjustly accused of being asleep at the switch. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But
well, just to pause there really quickly. So Benedict the 13th is another one of my favorites. Actually, I forgive the name, but you may have seen I did an episode on him a while back. The Pope with excuse me, resting bitch face is the phrase, because he just looks like he's crabby all the time. But he was this really personally very holy man.
Yes.
I mean, and he's on the road to sainthood. He's at the first stage of sainthood. But I remember he was just a terrible administrator. Like, he just knew nothing about how to do it. So he was able to be taken advantage of. So I think
that's
you're
exactly
right. Yeah,
that's
it wasn't his fault, but it's just kind of negligent.
So he came from a very wealthy family. I don't mean to go off tangent, but this is really interesting.
Yeah, please, yeah.
He came from a wealthy banking family, the Corsini family in Florence, and they had ambitions for him that were, to be a cardinal and to go further. He didn't want anything to do with that. He turned his back on that when he was 18 and he joined the Dominicans, and he changed his name. And nevertheless, his family found a way to make him a cardinal. And then he became a pope because of his devout faith. People there was there are alternating sort of themes within these conclaves. Hey, we want a pope who's a good administrator. We want a pope who's very fervent in his faith. We want someone who's a good negotiator with outside, political states. It kind of varies with the time. They balance those things. They really wanted someone who was fervent. And I think they also saw that this person could be easily manipulated.
Sure.
Because he was
I think there's two good analogies that I've always thought of in terms of that. So, I mean, there's always political punditry as far as American presidents. You say, oh, well, there's usually 4 or 8 years of Republican leadership, and then the pendulum swings back, and then a Democrat gets elected, and then back it goes. Who knows? Obviously, we're not going to get into that, but who knows where it goes from here. But generally, that's kind of how it goes, and it kind of makes sense, to kind of keep things balanced, just kind of naturally. And then, as far just I think for the listeners, and you've probably gleaned this too, maybe a good comparison would be like a professional athlete when they get their first big contract. There's stories and stories and stories of people who say, "Oh, when I first got my first big check, all these people started coming out of the woodwork. This, second, third cousin once removed is like, I want a little piece of the action here and there." That was kind of the nature of being a cardinal or being an abbot, like leader of a monastery. You get incredibly wealthy. The family gets incredibly wealthy or further enriched in that sense. Just as kind of like, I think, an analogy to maybe make a little bit more sense of it. But it is a really remarkable story, and sad though that he ended up being taken advantage of, unfortunately, still.
Yes, and he got chastised by everyone after the fact, after he died. But that's a great analogy. I think that's a very apt analogy. He was kind of in over his head in terms of being able to handle with all that stuff. But it's the papal conclave of 1740 that gets Cardinal Lambertini and elevates him to Benedict the 14th, and he names himself after his patron, Benedict the 13th. So it kind of explains why he's the 14th, because of his, because of the fondness that he had for Benedict the 13th. And he never he never campaigned for the job. It was the longest conclave, as far as I know, it was the longest conclave on record. It went for 6 months, and they're all stuck in the Sistine Chapel.
It was probably one of the longest ones in of the modern conclaves. I know that there was kind of a random one in Viterbo that took 2 years, but there was kind of some other extenuating circumstances. Probably the longest one in Rome, I would say. And at that point in the book, I was just in Rome, as you know, and so toured through the Sistine Chapel, and the imagery that you wrote about of how the Sistine Chapel was turned into dormitories. for all these cardinals, I'm thinking, where the heck did they put all these guys?
Yeah,
Like it must have been so cramped, and then they're in there. What, a few of them died, did you say, or one or two got ill and died?
A couple got sick and died. These are not young men.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. Their constitutions are not, especially 60 back then is not 60 today, right?
Yeah.
And I think the conference you're discussing in Viterbo, I'm not sure if those popes had to stay in one room during that, for that duration. You know what I mean? Just imagine you're stuck in a room with no running water.
Let alone plumbing.
Yeah,
we can't even imagine.
And your food is literally on a turntable. It's delivered on a turntable. You have no contact with anyone on the outside world other than through written notes, right? That might be passed. And there's rampant gambling going on, by the way, which is another really amazing fact. Rampant gambling. People were betting and gambling on the outcomes, like we would bet on sports events. It was fascinating. So Benedict, for the entire 6 months, did not campaign at all. As far as we know, he didn't want to be Pope. It came up almost one day on August 16th. They had started on February 16th, plus or minus. And now here we are exactly 6 months later. And he's having tea at like 2 a.m. with one of his friends, a cardinal. And the cardinal, I think it's Acquaviva, asks, hey, so what do you think? Would you want to be Pope? And he says, well, I don't know. I suppose. Right? I don't know what the conversation. But within a few hours, there's a clamor for Lambertini and his candidacy. Within 12 hours, he is elected Pope by large margins. And it's one of the most remarkable episodes, I think, in papal history, I would think, in terms of conclaves. And and that's how he became Pope Benedict XIV. And he's coronated 5 days later underneath that same dome that he's going to learn about in 2 years that's falling apart.
Yeah, that's such a remarkable story. And I'm sure if he was asked if he wanted to be, he said, hell no. But if they asked, would you? It's like one of those things where, it's disputed here and there, depending on who you ask, in Catholic circles or non-Catholic circles or whatever, if, how much the Holy Spirit influences the choice, or if like the Holy Spirit inspiring the pick of who the Pope is like a more drawn out sort of thing, like over the grand scheme. But you can almost imagine something like that where he just gets this little tinge, like this little calling of sorts before the election, where he said, "Okay, I think I need to," because what's the old adage? "May God forgive you for what you've done," is what they always report to say to the other cardinals after they're elected. There's lots of stories like that, but
there are quotes in the book that kind of allude to that he knew what he was getting himself into once he had gotten himself into it. And I think he was kind of hesitant about it. He loved being a cardinal in Bologna. He was the Archbishop of Bologna. He had transformed that city. He wasn't just an ecclesiastic official. He loved his people. He would visit hospitals. He would improve the quality. He would insist on improving the quality of nursing around the city, especially in women's health. He insisted on boys and girls going to school. He insisted on penal reform so that torture was no longer permitted. He really, and maybe even most remarkably, was when he saw women who had academic promise, he personally promoted them and gave them opportunities so that they could thrive. And unheard of across Europe. He was enlightened, right? He wasn't just, and he was very spiritual. He was very devout in his faith, but he really drove the church forward on many important socially progressive issues. And he did not want to leave Bologna. And yet, when he was elected Pope Benedict XIV, he never saw Bologna again.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Because it's not that far away, is it? But I mean, it's just one of those things where there's a million problems. I mean, I guess Pope Francis hasn't gone back to Argentina, and he could have a lot of different times.
It's
but
about
still,
200. It's about 200 miles by Bologna. It's like probably a 3-hour drive, something like that. I mean, it's not terribly far. Of course, we're not driving, and their opportunity was horseback and carriage. But nevertheless, I mean, people made that route all the same. But it just goes to show you how burdensome the papal office became. Right? He just could never break away from his duties once he became pope. And then you have this dome falling apart. And in fact, if you read the book, you'll see that many of the issues he's dealing with are remarkably the same as what we're dealing with today. Wars, the meaning of marriage, enslavement, papal diplomacy, anti-Semitism, fiscal deficits.
Just the most basic human need, right. Like starvation, unemployment, all that type of thing. The city in ruins, different things like that. Yeah.
And so the story is, okay, Vanvitelli gives him these bad news and grim news. And Vanvitelli has some ideas how to fix it. He doesn't think it's that big a deal. But the Pope, Benedict XIV now, formerly Lambertini, says, you know what? I'm not sure if I'm buying all this because it's all intuition, right? There's no basis for it other than you think it's going to work.
Right.
And because of his grounding in science and especially the Principia, Newton's Principia, he thought in physics and modern mathematics, he thought, well, what's the harm of asking people who know something about science and might be able to come up with an alternative point of view? So he brings in these...
Yeah, I was going to say that's a perfect point to maybe just kind of preface, because obviously, I mean, it was a whole chapter or 2 or 3, but where science was. 'Cause obviously, we have engineering, and then there's all sorts of like subcategories of engineering as just one discipline. But there's instructional engineering, which you are, right? Correct? Yes. Yeah, you said there's math and science. Like math, they're baked together now to where you'd think, how could I build something without doing math or geometry? One discipline of mathematics or something. But back then it wasn't really the case. So maybe just kind of a preface of the point in the development of that, where the world was right before that happened and why it was so remarkable that Benedict did what he did and kind of the reactions, I guess, to it probably too.
And that's really the thrust of the book, is that it's something really important. It's not just that it was Michelangelo's dome at St. Peter's Basilica. It's something very important happened here. And prior to Benedict's getting these mathematicians involved, these 3 mathematicians involved, construction was very rule of thumb and subjective. It's how thick should that column be or that beam be, or how deep should my foundations be? I don't know. But let's just dig. Okay, I think the soils aren't very good here. Let's go 5 feet. Right? What should the dimensions of this column be? Well, the building's going to be about 30 feet tall, a lot of stone. It's pretty heavy. Let's make it 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. And if we're wrong, we'll buttress it, right? We'll come, right? There was no, and it's not that it's their fault. They just didn't know how these forces of nature, how to quantify them. And they didn't know the strength of the materials they were working with, right? And over I'd say between, say, 1450 to about 1700, there's a tremendous impetus to try to solve these issues, mostly in the laboratory, right? It's all mostly theory. And Da Vinci's part of it, Galileo's part of it, a guy named Van Musschenbroek is part of it, and there are others, Simon Steven, Robert Hooke, Isaac Newton, and the book goes into these, and they're remarkable people, right? The things they were thinking were, I'm an engineer, and this forced me to get to know them better, and just remarkable. So by the time the dome needs to be fixed by Benedict, or he calls these three mathematicians in. By the way, these three mathematicians were young guys, but they were the preeminent physicists of their day. They knew Isaac Newton's work better than anyone else because they had written on it. And they understood all these theories because they had studied it. There was another guy named Bernoulli who came up with this theory of virtual work. A lot of these very esoteric concepts. What these mathematicians did is they said, we have this big problem. They don't know anything about construction. They've never designed anything in their lives, but they do know mathematics and they do know science. And they say, what if we can take some of these concepts and arithmetically calculate the weight of the dome? And what if we can calculate the capacity, the resistance of the elements in the dome? And if the amount of force is greater than the resistance, that's the source of the problem. That's why we have a problem. And if we can create more capacity, more resistance to overcome that force, then we can solve the problem. They're the first ones ever to think of a problem in the real world and say, let's solve it consciously with arithmetic mathematics and applied science. We'll take it out of the laboratory, out of the classrooms, and we'll put it into a real situation and try to solve it. And that is what engineering is. We take every day, we take a real world problem and we use arithmetic calculations and scientific principles, combine them together to come up with a solution. And it's not just civil and structural engineering, it's mechanical engineering, it's chemical engineering, it's how we put rockets into space, it's how we solve problems with diseases, how we identify disease, how we formulate gasoline for our automobiles. It's our phones, right? It's the development of our phones. Almost everything we touch and every device or convenience that we have is a product of this marriage between mathematics and science to solve a real world problem. And for the first time in history, that concept was used to fix the domes at Michelangelo's dome at St. Peter's Basilica.
Yeah. Oh, it's just so remarkable, especially when you say it like that and you extrapolate it out to the things that we're used to now that are just normal parts of our day that it's easy to take for granted. It's like you get your steak at the supermarket, but how many people actually think of the cow that had to, give its life to be able to make your delicious steak or whatever, you just don't think of it, which is the rancher who took care of it all.
Right. Right. But then again, I'm really not surprised because engineering by its nature requires teamwork and a lot of anonymity. So, and when you think about how the story plays out, these mathematicians came up with this wonderful idea. And then for a variety of circumstances, they're excluded from further participation. And that's kind of the way a lot of engineering solutions happen, where an engineer will come up with a solution and then they present it. And then there's a sort of a social outcome or a political outcome or an agenda. And then the engineers get kind of pushed aside once the solution's been identified and they've served their useful need, right? And then you move. So that's what you see in the book is not uncommon, what you see to a lot of engineers. They're not famous. They often work in large teams and you don't know their names, but that's the nature, I think, of the work.
There's something, I think there's something powerful in that, like the hidden life that comes with, like there's maybe at first blush, nothing particularly spiritual about engineering, but, nuns, they always say, you thank nuns for praying for this, like the world to not be destroyed. I mean, it's kind of one of those things where like, that's what cloistered nuns do, is pray for, the benefit of the world and, the health of mankind, like all that type of thing. And it's like, the hidden life is baked into that in a way that kind of like halfway makes sense. But you wouldn't really compare the two between, engineers and nuns share something in that sense, but to the benefit of mankind, namely that we don't get squished by the floors above us, the building, but we can all thank an engineer for making sure that that's not the case, right? Yeah. That we're walking upstairs and not falling to our demise or something like that. Well, and there's something beautiful in that, I think.
That's a really beautiful analogy in a way. Both these nuns and these engineers are under the radar. You wouldn't even necessarily know they're there, but they have a contribution that is invaluable. And the world is definitely a better place for both of them, right? For the existence of both of them. And we often take them for granted. That's a very, very beautiful analogy. Thank you for that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I don't know that that's ever occurred to me. Well, it never really occurred to me until you said it like that, but then it seems like an apt comparison, I suppose. And then it's also really remarkable to think just you could see the hand of the divine, I suppose, in terms of letting St. Peter's Basilica get to the point that it did so that humanity can benefit from that problem being solved, which we're still reaping the benefits of, and hopefully our society will for centuries more to come, because it's like 6 degrees of separation, from Benedict XIV to Elon Musk or something like that, shooting rockets into space. It's not that distant of a comparison, because who knows when it would have been resolved if not for this problem, I suppose. Who knows when science and math would have been married?
I hadn't thought about that. It's a way of saying God let the issue percolate to bring it to the point of such possible catastrophe that it forced the Pope to think differently, or it compelled the Pope to think differently. And out of that came this beautiful new idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, and for such a time as this, I don't know where that phrase comes from, but the Benedict XIV was, did you say, I think when we were first chatting before we started recording, that there was no other guy who could have done this?
Yeah, no.
For 100 years before, maybe for 100 years since. So just exactly at the right time.
That's exactly right. And again, I didn't know much if anything, about popes before I began my research. I knew about Julius II because of his contentious relationship with Michelangelo, and Leo X, again, primarily because of his relationship with Raphael. But I didn't really know anything else. And Benedict was in the middle of, he reigned from 1740 to 1758. And when you look at his two predecessors, obviously Benedict XIII, we talked about, was in way over his head. He could not have dealt with it. He just didn't have the intellectual horsepower. Clement XII, who came after Benedict XIII and preceded Benedict XIV, he was old and he was very feeble. Although he was energetic, especially the last few years of his administration, he was blind and he was bedridden. He really could not have done it. And so Benedict was Benedict XIII is 1723, and the cracks are still forming at that time. And then when you look at the popes that antedated Benedict XIV, there's Clement the 13th and the 14th. Clement the 13th was more concerned about nudity and covering nudity.
Oh, he was the guy. I forgot that. Yeah, he was the loincloth pope, right?
He was the loincloth pope. That was his concern, right? And then Clement the 14th had to deal with the Jesuits and their expulsion or their suppression. And he was, and we talked about this, he was heartsick over the decision he had to make under tremendous pressure. And he fell into a deep mental depression once he made his decision, and he died a short amount of time, probably, and that depression probably contributed to that.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
So you're talking about a 50 to 60 year period when the cracks are at their worst. The only one who had the mental stamina, the intellect, the objective sort of problem-solving capability was Benedict XIV. And he was the right man at the right place at the right time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's remarkable. Well, and to think of all the other possibilities, the 6 months worth of trying to pick a successor, the next successor of Peter, and then, any of those cardinals, if they had ended up pope, what would they have done if they would have ignored it or something like that? Yeah.
He was the only guy. There may have been one or two other cardinals who saw eye to eye with Cardinal Lambertini in terms of the importance of science and the scientific revolution and how science is not a threat to the church, but it's just a marvelous illustration of God's creation.
Yeah. The world's intelligible and should be understood to its fullest extent. Right. Yeah.
So he was there may have been a few comrades who he could talk about with this, but no one was as thoroughly immersed in these scientific happenings as Benedict XIV. He was, again, the right man at the right place at the right time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's incredible. Well, so maybe shifting gears just a little bit more broadly, because we don't want to give away too much more of the book. I mean, it's such a remarkable story, well worth getting it. I was jotting down, just as one example. I mean, I'm jotting down the notes, the books that you referenced. I want to go get those, the biography of Benedict XIV, all of these. There's so much, it's such a rich depth of study that you did. So who, you already kind of alluded to some of them, but who would you say, I don't know, maybe two or three more heroes and villains of the story that you encountered? Maybe especially, I don't know, the ones that you didn't expect to find until after, yeah.
So when I started this, I thought it was going to be a story about the dome, how it was built, how it was designed, how it got there, what happened, some of these concepts in science and math, how it was fixed. And that would be the story. It would be kind of clinical, more sort of focused on a thing, right? An object.
I'll be honest, I expected it to be a little bit more of that as well. I mean, which was still going to be great because it's interesting. I didn't know about it, but that it wasn't. Sorry,
that's what I thought it was going to be. Right. That's what I thought it was going to be. And then I start doing the research and I find out at every layer of the story, from Vatican Hill through to Old St. Peter's, to Michelangelo, to the dome construction by Sixtus V, it's populated by 30, 40 people at each of these tiers. Mm-hmm. And then when you get to the actual repair, which is the emphasis of the book, there's these amazing characters: Benedict, the Three Mathematicians, a guy named Giovanni Poleni, the most well-known scientist in Italy, who's part of this story, Luigi Vanvitelli, who we touched on. And then maybe one of my favorite was Nicola Zabaglia, the guy who, with all this high-minded design and theory, right, who is the one who's tasked with actually fixing it? Mm-hmm. and a guy who couldn't even read and write. And he had been on the Vatican since he was 16. He's now 79. And he's the guy who's tasked with fixing the dome. And he's one of the heroes. He's one of my favorite characters. He's very, he was just a wonderful character. And I never expected to encounter any of these guys except Benedict and except the Three Mathematicians. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I knew they existed, but I didn't know about them, their biography, how rich and colorful they would be. But then you encounter all these other characters along the way at every layer of the story. And it turns out to be, it's just a tapestry of human nature trying to tackle a difficult problem. And so the heroes, in my view, my favorite popes and sort of who drive the story forward. There's Nicholas V, who says, hey, we either have to fix old St. Peter's or we might have to come up with something new. Right. That is interesting because at that point, you got to remember old St. Peter's, it's a shrine, right? It's a venerable shrine. Anyone who is anyone, had visited old St. Peter's Basilica. Mm-hmm. And then there's Julius II who says, we're going to tear it down.
Well, what did you say? What in the book, did you say it was one of the walls was 6 feet?
Yes.
Hanging out?
Yes.
Out of plumb?
6 feet. Imagine you have a roof and a wall supporting it, and that wall is almost 6 feet out of plumb.
Oh my gosh. I can't imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a disaster waiting, right? And so you have Nicholas V, who also was one of the popes who was driving public works, improvements in public works at the time in Rome in the 1450s. Julius II, of course, he's the Papa Terribile. He had a notorious temper. He's the Pope who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. And that was partly due to get rid of Michelangelo because Michelangelo was set on sculpting this magnificent tomb for Julius. But then he changed direction and Michelangelo was so upset by that. And so Julius II thought he could get kind of push him out of the way by giving him this commission. And so Michelangelo didn't even want to do that. And by the way, Michelangelo had never even really picked up a paintbrush.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Before he painted the Sistine Chapel. That's how talented this man was. So Julius II is a character. Paul III, the guy who coaxed Michelangelo out of retirement. He's a hero, right? Because if not for Michelangelo, the results would have been far different. And again, I go into that in the book. The design of St. Peter's would have been dramatically different from what it is today. Mm-hmm. So Paul III played a huge role in that. And then Sixtus V was the Pope who said, we are going to put this dome and on top of this basilica, and we are going to finish it. I don't care how much money, I don't care how long it takes. But by the way, he asked Giacomo della Porta, his capo maestro, how long is this going to take? I'll give you what you need, but how long is this going to take? And the Duomo, the cupola in Florence, which is the basis for the design for the cupola in Rome, took 16 years. So Della Porta thinks and says, it's probably going to take 10 years. And the Pope says, no, we're going to have to do it in 30 months.
Oh my gosh.
And not only do they do that, but they do it in 22 months. They beat it. So they're working 7 days a week, through every weather, including lightning strikes, except for a brief pause on Sunday morning for morning mass.
And did you say an abbreviated morning mass too?
Yes,
it's like we're going to shorten it up. Yeah. Wow. So then those are the Hellenists. Yeah. Right.
Then again, of course, Benedict XIV. You can't forget.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
He's the ultimate hero. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then villains. There are two characters who I don't take a shining to, although they're very important figures. One is Giovanni Bottari, and he turns out to have this very polemic personality. And I think we all know people like this in our lives who take an enjoyment out of just antagonizing and
Yep.
arguing, right? And that's his nature. That was his nature. He enjoyed just apparently never really finding the silver lining, never finding blue sky. He just enjoyed being dour and unpleasant. To him, he was very intelligent. He was highly regarded in academic circles. He was the prefect of the Vatican Library. He taught at La Sapienza, the University of Rome. There was no question that he was intellectually, very, I don't want to say superior, but he had a high standing in the intellectual community. But he had this corrosive aspect to his personality. And he was the one, we think, who forced these mathematicians out of the picture after they had come up with their solution. And that was primarily because we think that no one really understood what these mathematicians were saying. They didn't really understand the concepts. And yet what they ended up doing was following the same solution.
Jeez.
But they didn't even recognize that it was the same solution. They didn't even understand that they were using the same solution. And my book goes into the frustration that these mathematicians were expressing because they knew that they were on the right track. They knew it. They were convinced that this was the way to go. And they knew they were going to have to defend it. But they were defending it against people who had no idea what they were talking about. It was sort of like, imagine you have a college professor teaching a class of sixth graders, right? And trying to convince them of something that that the sixth graders were not prepared to understand yet. They just hadn't got intellectually developed there yet. And so they got forced off. Those mathematicians get forced off the job primarily because of Bottari. And then Lelio Cassetti is another guy who he's not a cardinal, but he's a member of the Curia. He's in the Curia. And he does not like these ideas either. He has dramatically different ideas about the mathematics and the science that's being applied. He believes that these cracks are being caused for fundamentally different reasons, but at least he's arguing on the scientific level, right?
Sure.
Right? At least he's kind of acknowledging the science, but he's thinking, no, you guys have got it wrong. And he's kind of disparaging and dismissive of what they do, but he's very important because he then promotes the work that's going on by Nicola Zabaglia around the Vatican. And he is a real advocate for Zabaglia's work, who's building these amazing structures that's helping that's helping builders build their structures. And it's because of him and Cassetti and his desire to show how progressive the Vatican could be that he promotes a book that Zabaglia writes, and Cassetti ghostwrites. And it's through that book that we know so much about Zabaglia and his wonderful efforts in construction that actually had great influence over the next 200 years and in Europe and North America. So I'm not, Cassetti has some goods and some bads, but Bottari is definitely, in my view, the sort of the driving demon in this story.
Which, I think, like you alluded to, every story needs one of those because it makes it that much sharper in some sense. You almost need the Debbie Downer, Indeed, the one who questions everything. Well, Benedict XIV himself was the so-called devil's advocate in
Yes.
canon law cases, right? To make sure, I mean, and that in some semblance like still exists in the annulment process, for instance.
Yeah.
Today, to make sure, like we're going to try and poke holes where there might be holes. If there's no holes, great. But at least we tried just to make sure that we, tried to disprove it or something. So,
Right.
yeah, that's very good.
I think the difference here is Batari did it because he liked it and he liked the unpleasant, right? He couldn't help himself. Whereas I think the devil's advocate does it on a more objective basis, right?
Yeah. Maybe there were some who enjoyed that job, but at least we know this guy did. Yeah, we know this guy did for sure.
There might be some who loved that job because that fit into their personality, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's very funny. Yeah,
right.
I always love that because again, you don't necessarily expect there to be heroes and villains, like you said. I really like that characterization. That even in something like, just assume we're just going to be fixing a dome. How complicated could it be?
Right.
But then, here without all of this cast of characters,
I never expected these cast of characters to even exist, let alone build the story around. And when I was starting to discover them, it turned into, okay, let me tell you their biographies and how they fit into the story, right? And then as I was finishing chapter 10, and there are 11 chapters and an epilogue, as I was kind of winding down, I realized that I was telling their story, right? That their voices, I was asking myself, am I telling the story the way they would have seen it, the way they would have wanted it told? And I really wanted to put myself in their shoes. And I hope I did that because it turned out to be completely different, right? I mean, I was ending up being I happened to be the one fortunate enough to tell their story, as opposed to I'm an author coming in and telling some kind of history, third party, a third person. It really turned, I hope that comes across.
Yeah. Well, it certainly did to me. And again, it resonates to me too, because that's a lot of how I hope to do, tell these biographies of popes. Because there's always going to be, biases or historical coloration based on our own experience in the modern world or something. But just to some extent, to be able to say, these were people who had actually maybe that's a good segue too. I'd love to know some of your favorite quips from Benedict XIV. To kind of illustrate his personality, but to be able to, it's so easy. I think since the dawn of photography, when we think of old photographs, we think of people with stone faces, not smiling. So we think, everybody from before 1800 must have just never smiled. They had no sense of humor, something like that. But it couldn't be further from the truth. So, and I love that you included some of that to that end with Benedict XIV in particular. You had a lot of those in there. But for some of the little quips of his personality, I think would be good to share.
So he was known for not only having a sharp intellect, but a very sharp wit. And he was one of those people who was able, apparently, to have a sort of a turn of phrase very easily. And so there's one of my favorites, and I think we talked about it, was when Von Vitelli is a young architect, one of his early patrons is a nephew of one of I think it was Innocent the 11th. I forgot his last name, but in any case, Benedict knows this young pope, this young cardinal. He's in his early 30s, and this cardinal is not known for working very hard. So the quip is that Benedict says, attributed to him, is, Annibale must have been born on a Sunday because he's opposed to servile works. But my favorite story about Benedict is that he's a person, right? And he apparently has, like some of us do, he's very liberal with some of his language sometimes. And he had very uncardinalish language, according to one of his biographers, very salty, very unbecoming for a cardinal. And he knew it, and he felt immediate remorse after he would use this language. And so to try to curb that habit, he would put a crucifix in his audience room, directly in his eyesight. And I wanted to put this in the book, but I couldn't find a place to do it. It's the best story. So he is constantly using this crucifix as his form of, his way of stopping a bad habit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So apparently he's in an audience room. He's in his audience room with 3 cardinals one day. And according to the secretary who's there, he's noticing that Benedict's eyes keep going to that crucifix.
Oh, gosh. Mm-hmm.
And it's noticeable, much more noticeable than on most sessions. And you can see, according to the secretary, that in his body language, Benedict is getting rather frustrated.
Yeah.
So Benedict finally, at some point in the meeting, orders the crucifix be removed from the audience room.
Oh.
And then he lets him have it. Yeah, and that just goes to show you, he was a person. These popes are people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't. I mean, yeah, it's great that he's witty, and it's great that people like him, but he used bad language,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he knew he did, and he couldn't, even though he knew it wasn't cardinalish or popish.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't, he's a human being, right? And you push that person to their limits, and they're going to be like you and I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's incredible. Well, yeah, you read even the longest biography of a pope takes you or I, a week or two or however long to read, but that was just such a small portion of their life that there's probably infinitely more stories like that or something so I think that's incredible. Yeah, thanks for sharing those.
It's
Mm-hmm.
interesting you say that too, Matt, is that you would think that there probably is a lengthy biography of Benedict XIV in the Vatican Library. I'm sure that it exists. But in terms of the popular press or the accessible press, one thing that surprised me was that it's hard to get accessible information about their biography.
Mm-hmm.
That is not just sort of like a list of deeds, right? Sort of their childhood, their likes and dislikes. Who were their friends? What do they like to do in their spare time? Right? It's hard to get that information, and it comes from a variety of sources. It's not just one biography. You might get one biography that speaks to certain parts of his personality, and then another biography that speaks to another. And then it's limited. There might be 3. And that's for Benedict XIV. There are some people in this book for which there is no biography. And my book is sort of the first effort to create a biography.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, and so important too. It's also striking me that we haven't actually said the names of the 3 mathematicians, which I find really ironic, because we're talking about all these other people, and then how the mathematicians descended into obscurity.
Yeah.
But yeah, you noted that it was one of them. There was quite a bit known about them, but there wasn't really much known about the other 2.
Yeah. So there are 3 mathematicians, and their seminal paper, their seminal finding, when Benedict calls them to the dome, he asks for their opinion, and they take 3 months to analyze the situation and to write up their findings. And what they wrote up was called the opinions, or parare. It's a very long, lengthy title. It's shortened to the opinions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's written by the 3 mathematicians, Thomas Lasserre, Francois Jacquier, both of them were French, and then Ruggiero Boscovich, who was from Croatia. None of them are Italian by birth, but they're all Italian by culture and training. Mm-hmm. And they're all in their mid to early 30s. And Lasserre and Jacquier are the ones who have just translated and perform what's called a commentary to Isaac Newton's Principia, So if anyone knows about Newtonian physics, it's those two, probably preeminent experts in Europe at the time, which was, by the way, it's a very hard book to read and let alone understand. Okay. Right. And these guys were experts in it. And then Boscovich was part of it because he was probably the preeminent physicist in Rome at the time. And the three of them teamed up at Benedict's request. And it was Boscovich who later became a very famous scientist, particularly in the infancy and the development of early, believe it or not, molecular theory. He's one of the first people to come up with atomic theory.
Incredible.
Right? But even then, it took 100 years for people to understand. I mean, the guy, when you think about it, he comes up with ideas that are generations ahead of this time. He's misunderstood. No one understands him. He dies in relative obscurity. Lesueur and Jacquier are lesser known, but are just as important because they're the ones who came up with the whole idea of fixing the dome the way they did in the first place. Boscovich is kind of the third line author of Ferrari. He's there more for the, what's the word, for the gravitas, to add gravitas to the findings. And so it's remarkable. Their story is remarkable when you think about it. Very unassuming. They were all priests, right? And which kind of undercuts the whole idea that the church and science are incompatible.
Right.
That's not true. It's just all around. It's just a remarkable story full of remarkable characters.
Yeah, that's great. I really loved learning about them in particular. But again, all of the heroes and villains were interesting in their own right. So maybe one last question before we wrap things up. So what would you say is, for the people who don't particularly have an interest in engineering, who don't particularly have an interest in papal history, but love a good story, maybe I have for sure probably seen pictures of St. Peter's Basilica, maybe they've been to Rome or something like that. What's kind of the most fascinating takeaway from a story like this for somebody like that?
A lot of takeaways, but I think the biggest one is that we can do a lot when we team together and we collaborate. There was no one person who could have pulled it off. You needed leadership by Benedict. You needed inspiration and good ideas from the mathematicians. You needed pragmatists who could say, well, how do we actually do this? How do we do this respectfully? How do we team together to get this done? And it wasn't just the 7 characters in the book. Remember, there had to be dozens of carpenters and masons and iron workers who all worked in concert. This was done in a very short period of time, which is remarkable.
Well, did you say
build it years?
Yeah, right. Well, did you say building the dome was 800 workers at once?
Yeah,
all working vertically.
Yeah. It was just building the dome was a phenomenal effort, but repairing it. When you think about the limitations of communication,
sure, yeah,
and transportation, that you could go from August of 1742, when Benedict hears about the story for the first time, to December of 1744, when the first iron hoops, most of the iron hoops are installed. It's an amazing short amount of time.
Right.
Even by today's standards, that's a short amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes to show you how, with the right leadership, the right solutions, the right teamwork and collaboration, we can do the impossible. What we think is the impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I think that is the sort of the non-technical takeaway that I view from the book.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Well, and to think that they were doing it obviously to preserve an architectural icon for their own day.
Right.
But here's you and I and all of these other thousands, millions of people who appreciate St. Peter's Basilica now, let alone like in the 300 years that have been between our conversation and when that actually happened.
Right.
I think that they, like, their effort, like the fruit of something like that just goes so far beyond what anybody could ever imagine. To think that if they hadn't done this, nobody alive would have ever seen St. Peter's Basilica in all of its glory. Who knows what it would have even turned into if there would have been a new dome built or
right.
what. But
right. We don't know. And you know, Benedict rightfully deserves credit. And it's a very nice, I don't know if it's intentional or just a happy coincidence, but his monument in St. Peter's Basilica is just a stone's throw away from the dome that he saved.
Right.
One of the nice little facts in Vatican history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really remarkable. I didn't know the extent of this story when I was going through St. Peter's Basilica, but thinking about that now, as you're saying that, it's just even more. It's just makes it even that much cooler, because here he was getting elected underneath a dome that may well have crumbled onto his head at any moment, and then for all eternity, right? Yeah, for all of time. There's
he doesn't even know. He doesn't even know about the cracks yet, right? When he coronated, he doesn't even know about the cracks, and yet here he is. He solved the problem, and his monument is literally a stone's throw away. It's right around the corner from the four main piers that support the dome.
Yeah, and how many people walk by or standing by it, looking up at the dome, admiring it, without knowing that the guy who is responsible for it still standing
is right there,
is laying right there. Yeah.
And we talked just a little bit about the weight of the dome, just for people to sort of get a grasp. And I try to do this in the book. The weight of the dome has been calculated as, think of like a modern sports stadium, and I live in Los Angeles, so think of Dodger Stadium. It can support 16,000 cars, right, on a sellout. Well, the weight of the dome has been estimated, when you think about the millions of pounds, it's equivalent to about 18,000 cars. So you'd have to take all the cars on Dodger Stadium plus 2,000 more, lift them 30 stories, and stack them neatly into about 2 square blocks of Manhattan, right? Without modern machinery to do it, without modern hoists, cranes, right? That's what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And Giacomo della Porta, when he built it with Sixtus V, they didn't know. They couldn't calculate the weight. They didn't know about this concept called thrust that was going to be so divisive and hurtful, destructive. They didn't know if their techniques were going to work or not. They didn't know how long it was going to take. They were all like, it was all done on a prayer, literally.
Right.
Prayer.
Yeah, it's incredible, like literally unbelievable, literally incredible that to think of that visual that you said in the book. I remember reading that, and just I had to take a second, one, to visualize it, but two, to just think, standing under it. It feels like you just kind of subconsciously assume that a dome is made out of like fairy dust and feathers or something, but it's not actually really, but it's what, 17 feet thick in places, and it's all stone, brick, and mortar.
Yes.
And so it's just a bunch of rocks, and iron, right, suspended over your head, 350 feet of it, is it, in the air, 30
on
stories?
Average. And by the way, I was in Florence Cathedral, as part of the research, when I was doing the research. And there's a point where you can climb the steps and look down into the interior of the crossing, what's called the crossing, the central part of the dome. Mm-hmm. And from 180 feet, which is just the base of the dome, you can get vertigo. And I deal with construction. I don't have a problem with vertigo, but I did have, there's nothing separating you from that crossing, and you're only 18 stories above the floor.
My
Here,
gosh.
you're 30 stories above the floor. And that's the start of the dome. And then it goes to 465 feet. So these workers were indebted to Zabalia because Zabalia, the construction guy, was devoted to the safety, keeping the safety of his workers. They loved him because he was always mindful of designing scaffolds that would keep them safe. But again, it just goes to show you, it was perilous. What they did, it was perilous.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just something casual. This was life and death, and to many of the workers who were at that site.
Well, gosh, scaffolding up the side of a 2-story house is like nerve-wracking enough, at least for somebody who's not normally climbing ladders or climbing scaffolds all the time.
Yeah.
But to multiply that by 30 or 60 or whatever it would be, it's just, yeah.
And I try to give a sense, if you're one of those workers on the staging, on those scaffolds, what life would have been like. And by the way, if anything happened to them, there was no medical insurance.
No, yeah, right? Of course not.
For them or their dependents, right? So we kind of take that for granted too.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, again, my goal was to put a reader today, in their shoes. How would they have felt? How would they have looked at this problem? How do we look at the solution in that context? And I hope people enjoy it. It's not, there's a lot of facts, but they're necessary facts because I want people to understand the situation as best they could.
Yeah. Well, I think having read it, you did a remarkable job with that. Again, it was, full of surprises at every turn, an incredible story. And again, I'm a nerd for this stuff. Everybody who listens to the show knows that. You now know this because I think you also kind of are. But you don't have to be an engineering nerd, a papal history nerd, church history, whatever, to read it and enjoy it by any stretch. So, so I think it's well worth getting it. So we have one other question, of course, and that question is who would be, maybe have given away a little bit, but maybe there's some surprises here. I don't know. So who would you say your top 3 favorite popes? If you want to spice things up and skip over Benedict XIV if he's the obvious choice, but by any stretch or by any means, who would you say are your top 3 favorites?
I think Paul III has to be one of my favorites because he's the one who coaxed Michelangelo into basically redesigning St. Peter's to the Basilica that we know today and designing the dome and keeping Michelangelo sort of in the game for the next 18 years. It's because of him that Michelangelo did what he did at the Basilica. And he also was the patron of the altar wall on the Sistine Chapel, the Last Judgment.
That's right. Yeah.
So Paul III really is, I think, a very important and he's a charming guy. And so, on a number of fronts, he's an important figure. Sixtus V was not just the guy who inspired the construction of the dome, but again, he's the father of modern Rome. Yeah, and so again, I didn't know this. I've read their names on a page, right? When you study art history, there are Paul III. He commissioned the altar wall at St. Joe. Okay, Paul III. So now I know there's Paul III, but I didn't know the person, and I didn't know the name about. And by the way, Paul III came from very well-to-do, luxurious background, right? Sixtus came from very modest. He was a sheep herder. And he came from very modest backgrounds. And I guess it shows the marvelous opportunity within the church, right? Where people of modest means can be elevated, right? He was just determined. And I think maybe the third one, I kind of, Benedict XIII, we've spoken a little bit about. He was he was very devout. He was taken advantage of. His naivete was taken advantage of But I think the fact that he saw the promise in Cardinal Lambertini, and he was the one who promoted Lambertini to be a cardinal. Without Benedict XIII, there may never have been a Benedict XIV. Right? So we got to give him credit for recognizing talent. And I think that that's worth a lot.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, his own, I guess, personal holiness aside, as far as you like, maybe if we're just looking contributions while Pope, you could almost overlook all of the other administrative foibles of his and getting taken advantage of and all that. Like you said, I think earlier, you weigh the good with the bad. If we're comparing the contribution of Benedict XIII to the church, society, humanity as a whole, it seems like he comes out pretty well ahead, because without him, there maybe would be no Elon Musk, right? Extrapolate it all the way out, because there's no Benedict XIV. The science and math, maybe never, engineering, who knows how much longer it would have taken. No, I jest. But I mean, but there's maybe somewhat of a point there that even with a guy who was not that great administratively, he was still faithful enough to invest in, somebody he believed in, like you said, and was a good enough judge of character. Yeah,
he was a good judge. Yeah, at least on that instance, he was an excellent judge of character, and we are the beneficiary of that.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I really appreciate that, and thank you again for being a guest on the show, for writing this great book. While I was writing, I think I have a list of 6 or 7 people that I'm going to get it and give a copy to, because it's so good. Right. Saving Michelangelo's Dome. And I'll try. Yeah. I'll try to post the video version of this too. I'm trying to get more into publishing the video edition of the podcast too, just if there's people who would rather watch it like that. So that's good to have a picture of the book. But you can find it where, maybe go through real quick where people can find more about you, more about the book. Where can they find it? Amazon or wherever.
Sure. So my website is wayneKalayjian.com, Kalayjian. But it's real easy to find the book. Just Google Saving Michelangelo's Dome, or word search it. It comes up on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. Tons of bookstores are now picking it up. Many of the major book selling platforms have it. If you just web search that, Saving Michelangelo's Dome, you'll have no trouble. It's a little bit of first time author. It's no longer, but it was for a time the #1 bestseller in architectural history, #1 in Italian history, and #4 in art history. I'm very proud of that.
Congratulations. That's great.
So obviously, I think there's a segment of the reading population that enjoys it, and I'm glad.
Yeah, good. Well, whatever small amount we can contribute to that, for sure. I'll make sure to post the link in the show notes here, and then on our social media too, obviously. But can't say enough good things about it, and I'm excited, like I said, to dive more deeply into like the bibliography. But maybe that could just be me. I don't know. But the bibliography and the notes for all the chapters and things. Wayne Kalayjian is the author. Saving Michelangelo's Dome is the book. Once again, thank you, Wayne, for being on the show. We really appreciate it.
It has been a pleasure, Matt, really, to get to know you a little bit better, and hopefully your audience too. And thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, there you have it. So thanks again for listening to the end. We hope you really enjoyed that talk with Wayne, and especially hope you enjoy his book, Saving Michelangelo's Dome. So just a few housekeeping things. First, you can find a link to his book in the show notes here. We'll post it on our social media, so the link in our bio on our Instagram and on Twitter, of course. So please consider buying a copy of that book for yourself and a friend. You will not regret it. Second, if you're new to the show or you haven't already, please consider leaving a review for us on iTunes and Spotify. That just makes sure that more people can find the podcast who might be interested in this type of show. And third, if you'd like to support our work and you'd also like to get something like a sweet Popecast mug, limited edition, or a Popecast t-shirt, you can support us at patreon.com/thepopecast, or you can actually do so on your podcast app, so Spotify and iTunes, I believe. You can do that as well. And I guess fourth, lastly, if you need to find the past episodes of the show, or you'd like to listen to the backlog, or find our blog, you can also find all of that at thepopecast.fm. That's thepopecast.fm. So as we head out today, again, let us just be thankful to Wayne for all of the effort that he put into making this great book, to writing this great book for us, to Michelangelo for designing the Dome of St. Peter's as we know it today, and for all of those people whose names we do know and whose names we don't know, those whose names and stories are known only to the Lord at this point, for making sure that St. Peter's Basilica, in its construction, in repairing its dome, is here for us to enjoy and bask in the glory of today. And above all, let us never forget, these are strange times we live in, but they are no stranger than in ages past. Until next time, we'll see you.